I study ecosystem function and dysfunction around the world. So it's interesting to be in Sweden where there's so much biomass everywhere and accumulated organic matter. So this is a good result for Sweden, but it also points out the huge disparity between what you see here and what I see in many other parts of the world. So in Ethiopia or in Mali, Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, I find completely different situations where the vegetation cover has been massively degraded, biodiversity is being lost tremendously, and that means that the accumulation of organic matter has been vastly reduced. And this changes some natural systems. It reduces biodiversity, obviously, but it also reduces biomass and the infiltration and retention of rainfall that could naturally seep into the organic matter and into the biomass itself. And this is a very dangerous outcome because it's creating desertification over vast areas. It's creating food insecurity for billions of people around the world. The reason I'm engaged in studying function and dysfunction is that in 1995, the World Bank asked me to begin to document the Lus Plateau in China, which is the cradle of Chinese civilization. So in this place, you have an almost perfect example of how unsustainable agricultural practices carried out over centuries and thousands of years cause ecosystems to collapse. So this was a collapsed ecosystem with a lot of documentation because the Chinese keep records of everything going back thousands of years. So it's well documented that this place had been a beautiful place, that it gave birth to the largest ethnic group on the planet, but it was fundamentally ecologically destroyed. And in 1995, when I began to document this, the Chinese government, with World Bank support, was beginning to restore the area. And they looked at specific methodologies. They knew that the hydrological cycle was so badly disrupted, so basically no water would infiltrate into the ground because the dynamic of the droplets they would hit the surface and close the surface. It would become like cement. Then everything would roll off, and that erosion became enormous amounts of erosion. And then the sunlight would directly hit the exposed soils because there was no vegetation, and the temperatures and evaporation rates would be artificially elevated. So they decided to try to reverse the situation. If the trajectory had been the reduction of biodiversity causing the reduction in biomass, causing a reduction in the accumulation of organic matter, what about turning it around? So the first thing that they had to do was infiltrate the water, because if they didn't infiltrate the water, it would run off and you wouldn't have it in the system. So they made small-scale interventions to keep the water in the watersheds, and then they revegetated. But they also did something very, very important. They differentiated ecological and economic land. So they determined that not all the land was suitable for exploitation, and that in the past, the people had just said, land, it's land, we want it all. And if you did that, you destroyed everything. So they separated it, and by separating the ecological from the economic, it meant that maybe as much as 50 or 60% of the land is ecological. But by restricting the area that you're extracting from, you actually got much higher yields. So the productivity, it wasn't an either-or issue, it was you increased productivity by reducing the area in cultivation. So there were a number of remarkable things, and in following that project over 15 years, we've seen that it's possible to rehabilitate large-scale damaged ecosystems. and that this physically changes the infiltration retention of rainfall, the percentages of organic matter, fertility, microclimates, humidity, everything changes. So this is an important lesson because we have a lot of degraded land around the world. We're worried about temperature changes. Temperatures on exposed soils are 10 to 20 degrees higher in centigrade than they are below canopies. So if we're really worried about temperature changes, then there's one place we can physically work to change this, and everyone has a role to play in this. It's not that the United Nations or individual institutions or governments or big corporations or something. Everybody can participate, but we need to understand what's going on. So the need for organic matter, the need to align with long-term evolutionary trends. So from the beginning of evolutionary time, there was a consistent accumulation of organic matter. We disrupted that in the recent 10,000 years and began to reduce that. We have to change and get in line with that long-term evolutionary trend. And if we do, well, there'll be more places like Sweden. Well, I think we need to take this on board. I think that the fact is, if we're unconscious of the determining factors for life on Earth, where our air, our water, our food, and our energy come from, then talking about air, water, food, and energy or climate is ridiculous, because they're coming from functional ecosystems. They're not machines, they're not external somehow to life, they are caused by life. Our atmosphere was generated by plant life and respiration in symbiosis between plants and animals. So this has been going on for billions of years. Otherwise, we wouldn't have an atmosphere which was breathable. So we need to take that on board. The freshwater system, there wasn't fresh water. The fresh water was processed by the plants. And now we have fresh water. So we're not going to be able to invent this. It was evolved, and we are beneficiaries of this, but we didn't do it. And we're polluting it. We're destroying the system that makes this happen. So we need to understand and learn how it functions. And if we get in line with this, then we'll have a very good result. Well, I've started to see, why does degradation happen on a continuous basis in every continent over historical time? And it's connected to human economy. So the human economy is currently based on a major flaw. So this flaw is discernible and understandable. It is essentially that money and the economy is defined as the production and consumption of goods and services. That's what we call the GDP. And the sum of everything that we produce and consume is our global economy. Well, there's a serious flaw in logic there, because all the products and services are derived from functional ecosystems. And in our global economy, functional ecosystems are zero, if they're considered. If they're considered, they might be considered as externalities, but in fact, they're not external. They are central to our lives, so they're central to our economy. In fact, economy and ecology come from the same root word. So we've taken a fork in the road and we've missed something very important. Now, this flaw means that we have created perverse incentives to degrade the ecosystems because we're valuing a derivative rather than the primary source. And this mistake must be corrected. Otherwise, you always get the same result. So what I've been looking at is, how do you correct this? Now, there are a few initiatives. I've had some discussions with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the Natural Capital Initiative in the UK, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, or TEEB teams. And essentially what they're trying to do is monetize nature, to say to give a price to different resources. Well, I don't think that's really going to work, because, and this where they normally get stuck, is that the fact is you can't put a high enough value on them because they're really priceless. What is the value of air or water or biodiversity? And so you can't really do that. But what we do know is they're not zero. So it isn't really a question of absolute value, it's a question of relative value. So I think you can actually solve this problem by valuing ecosystem function higher than production and consumption of goods and services. So anything we discuss which doesn't include that as a starting point ends up with really confused outcomes, because we're looking at things individually and we're looking at infrastructural changes without looking at the foundation. The foundation is now broken. So if we continue to build on top of this broken foundation, we're not going to get a different result. What we need to do is fix the foundation. And the foundation is that now we value products and services above ecosystem function. And the interesting thing is, if you follow this scenario and you consider this, what would happen if ecosystem function were valued higher than production and consumption of goods and services? And suddenly, everything looks very different. So in that scenario, it's possible to conserve all remaining functional ecosystems, because that is to protect global wealth. And it's possible to restore all degraded lands wherever they are in the world, because that means it's possible to increase global wealth. And the disparity, the poverty and disparity that's been imposed on indigenous peoples all over the world disappears, because suddenly they are the stewards of ecosystems, and this is the most valuable thing you could be. There is a correction in terms of the people who have tried to corner the markets on all sorts of commodities, who have tried to monopolize or to enslave or colonize or exploit peoples all over the world and resources all over the world. But actually, that's what we need to change anyway, so that correction can become more like an evolutionary process rather than a revolutionary process. So I think it's going to change one way or the other. So we can change consciously because we decide to do it, or I think the situation will be out of our control and it will happen anyway. So I think understanding gives us a choice. There are not that many choices, but there is a choice to align with natural evolutionary trends, to recognize and change our values. So if we value ecosystem function higher than we value production and consumption of goods and services, then our economy and our money will reflect that. That is a collective species response on a planetary scale. That's what we need to do to ensure a sustainable future.